Sheeda and James spent that evening quietly unwinding from the events together. Of course, both of them had plenty of things they could have talked about. However, at the time it seemed most comfortable for them to simply enjoy each other's company, in silence. Lying on the massive bed the room in the hive provided to them, they had their heads next to each other, while their bodies pointed in opposite directions across the huge mattress, basically splitting the bed with one half being given to each of them, while only their temples touched every now and then. Sometimes, Sheeda's ear flicked slightly and gently brushed the side of James's head. Sometimes, James briefly disturbed the peace by needing to stretch and soothe his aching shoulders, that still always has some troubles ever since his original arm had been replaced with a much heavier one, despite the steps he took to circumvent that. But ultimately, nothing much really happened, and at least with James that was good. Of course, he couldn't know exactly how Sheeda felt about the situation, but since she could have easily broken up the monotony had she felt the need to do so, he figured she may have enjoyed it as well. After what had to have been a couple of hours in his mind, although he couldn't know for sure since he had not checked the time once during their silence, James momentarily lifted his head and looked over at the computer terminal integrated into the wall, wondering if he was hungry enough that it would be worth breaking the peaceful atmosphere to order some food in. However, completely indecisive on the topic, he decided to put it up to a vote. "You hungry, treasure?" he asked, after plopping his head back down and slightly twisting it so he could look over at the side of her head, which made her look more like a mass of wild brown hair than a person. Same set hair then rustled slightly as Sheeda moved her head to answer, and although the angle made it a bit hard to really gather, James felt like the gesture was supposed to indicate a no. At least, it looked more like a headshake than a nod to him. Well, in that case, he wouldn't bother either. Still, a couple of minutes later, the fact that he had broken the silence seemed to stir something within Sheeda. "I wonder how the other conference went," she said, although her face remained staring up at the ceiling. James blinked as he thought about that. "Well, we probably stole a good bit of their thunder," he finally said, with a strange background feeling in the back of his mind that he somehow ought to feel bad about that. Maybe it was just his wish of Deathworlders having more of a presence, and thus a hint of guilt emerging at most likely having pulled nearly the entire attention of the galaxy onto himself on a day that was meant for them to be able to have their place in the spotlight for once. But the lack of any security around this place, and no fires currently burning down the hive, indicates that things at least didn't end catastrophically. Sheeda released an indecisive-sounding chuff at his words. "You think they know what happened?" she then asked, with some thoughts about the meeting of Deathworlders clearly going through her mind that James couldn't quite decipher. James scrunched up his face for a moment as he contemplated that. They were in their own meeting, so there was a possibility that the use of phones and assistants and the like had been turned down to a minimum during that. However, ultimately, he doubted that any of them would have cut themselves off from the outside world to such a degree that they had somehow missed news this big. If he was entirely honest, he was half convinced that some of the additional news crews that had shown up at the Fairbank Taxi Hotel's conference room after the news of an AI at large had come out had originally been stationed at the conference of the Council of Deathworlders before being ordered to get their asses moving to the bigger story down the line. That would at least explain how they had mobilized so quickly. "I would assume so," he therefore answered, as his pondering came to an end. "Hard to believe they wouldn't. Why? Are you worried about something?" Sheeda made a raspy noise that even James couldn't quite identify. It almost sounded like she had choked on her own breath for a moment, but was clearly more deliberate than that. "Carfren was there. There's a good chance he wasn't happy about his nominal allies being so open with information that is very likely to get him and his government into some serious trouble," she explained, with a tone that wasn't worried specifically, but had an underlying tone of discomfort with the situation. I wonder what kind of colourful things he may have had to say about us. She was, of course, right. Galactically speaking, knowingly hiding away an AI was a crime, and Quafuem did not have the same protections that James Cowley enjoyed for himself. Still, given current tension-filled circumstances, James considered it at least unlikely that the de facto leader of Dunama was going to be arrested on the spot, like had happened for the Cimareskis. Especially if he was smart enough to keep his mouth shut on the topic, so evidence would have to be gathered. Especially since James suspected that certain contacts of his had of course been informed about Avesalon in the meantime, meaning that her presence wouldn't come as a surprise to some important people. Still, it was true that he, as humanity's at least apparent ally, had a good chance of poisoning the well with the rest of the council, should he have desired to do so. Nothing we can do about it now, James mumbled after a moment of thinking. Damage control on a huge scale was going to be in order anyway. Now they just possibly had to worry about some additional Deathworlders as well. Although, obviously, he too would have much preferred it if they could approach their fellows in a more amicable fashion. Then again, but given that he too was involved in hiding her, he probably can't condemn us too badly in public. Worst he can do is denounce us as traitors, since we revealed her, but only after she had already been revealed. I think we can talk our way out of that. That is, of course, assuming anyone still even wants to talk to us now that we have publicly associated with her realized. Sheeda exhaled through her nose. What about our allies? She asked, her tone indicating the term real being in there, without actually being spoken. How are they going to react? James held back a comedic retort that burned on his lips to relieve the tensions. Something like, well, I didn't get a call about Earth being under attack yet, or something like that. But instead, he decided to simply give the most honest answer he could give at that time. I assume the people upstairs have considered that before telling me to get out with it, he said, or more precisely confessed. Truth was, he didn't know. And although he had stumbled into being a sort of big figure in this ongoing conflict, he still didn't even come close to really influencing an event on such a huge scale apart from maybe being the face associated with it. They were talking about entire populations here. Populations that were going to deal with each other in their own ways, no matter if he was involved or not. Both Tonastrocytes and Paracini were exceptionally loyal people and respected humanity. But was loyalty and respect enough to shift their perspectives on such a huge issue based on the Deathworld primate's words alone? He was unsure. He wasn't even sure if there was an answer yet, or if one would only develop as the situation further unfolded. Usually, he didn't blindly follow orders he was given. He needed to have an idea of what was the purpose behind them and what they would achieve. But in this situation, he could admittedly only play his own part, while others played theirs. Hell, he couldn't even say if all of humanity was along for the ride at this point. Or more precisely, he knew that they weren't. The protests back on Earth were obviously not forgotten yet. This whole situation was just turning into more and more of a mess. And what about Avesalon herself? Sheeda continued her line of questioning, although it seemed more like she wanted to compare her own thoughts to James's, than as if she actually needed him to answer things for her. That one, James was the most sure about. I think she's terrified of what's going to happen next, he answered honestly. But that wasn't all of it. And I think that she's happy that all of the hiding has finally come to an end. She'll be able to make a case and speak for herself soon, instead of needing others to secretly do it for her. I just hope someone is going to be willing to listen. Well, we were, Sheeda pointed out after flicking her ears for a moment. James exhaled humorlessly through his nose. Yeah, but we seem to continue being a bad example of what the average person living in the galaxy is like, he mused, considering alone how much of a contrast he had posed to the other representatives of his order, the people he was technically supposed to be most alike to out of all the species, although it obviously didn't really work like that. Sheila exhaled through her teeth. One of the people a few rooms over is as big as a house, and can burrow through stone with huge claws. And not too long ago you had a 6-armed monkey with glowing eyes riding on your shoulder. I don't know what an average person will look like between those, she mused in reply, which honestly cracked James up a bit. Once again, she wasn't wrong. He figured that maybe having grown up among all this craziness of different people from different planets, that all looked like a crazy fantasy to her mind, helped in gaining some perspective. After all, she had been very young when she had left her homeworld. And ever since then, she had lived. Releasing a long breath, James felt awkwardness like a stone building up within him, as an uncomfortable question burned on his lips. The urge was there to swallow it down, since the peaceful atmosphere from earlier was still in his mind. However, just the fact of how uncomfortable it made him feel to only think about it, it told him that it would be important to get it out, and not for his sake. Hey, he started slowly, allowing his somber tone to hopefully prepare Sheila for what was ahead, instead of giving her whiplash by just suddenly springing it on her without warning. Although he still shifted his body around awkwardly, as his nerves searched for any release from the tension that was building within them. Are you all right after all that? Sheila made a vibrating sound that sounded slightly akin to a growl, but was nowhere near as aggressive, and James could hear the swooshing noise as her tail started to move across the sheets somewhere outside of his vision. Do you mean all that, or a specific all that? She called him out in his vagueness. He couldn't quite tell if he was annoyed with it or wanted him to be more direct for other reasons, but whatever may be the case, he quickly realized that he would have to pull himself together here, since no matter how hesitant he was about situations like this, it was still far harder for her, ultimately. The captain was arrested, he therefore brought out, forcing himself to not pull away from this conversation, even if his brain really wanted to. Even after all that's happened, I don't know. I guess I just want to let you know that you don't have to be quiet about it. He may have done a lot of wrong, but that doesn't mean it's wrong to still care. At this point, Sheila could apparently not take lying down any longer, and she quickly sat up into a half-kneeling position, with one hand supporting her weight by pressing into the bed. I don't know if I care, she said, seemingly in earnest, considering the firm yet deeply insecure expression on her face. There's a lot. A lot I don't understand. There's a part of me, one that wants to care a lot more, I think. One that remembers the man who basically raised me, taught me responsibilities and how to take care of myself, while also minding others around me. I know that he had ulterior motives by now, but not all he taught me was bad. I mean, whether I like it or not, I wouldn't be the person I am today without him. And the fact that I can be and work around humans as effectively as I can could be largely attributed to him. Whether he wanted me to be a pet project or not, he did raise me into an at least capable adult who can deal with most things life throws at her. I used to love him for that. For being the one person willing to deal and be patient with me. Later, Nalzam was also there, of course, but for the longest time, it was just the captain who nursed me when I was sick, or bandaged me when I got hurt, or just sat with me when I needed a moment. She looked into James's eyes for a long moment while taking a breath, after apparently having expended all of her air with the explanation. But there's another part of me that's just so angry. She then kept going, and her hand on the sheet curled into a fist, taking tight hold of the fabric while her face hardened. Controlling my anger was always something that was very important for him, and I always thought that was for a good reason. I mean, I still think it was, in a way. It's not wrong that I could seriously hurt a lot of people if I lose my temper. People like us, they're simply how we're built. We can be ourselves all we want, but we have to keep the kind of power we have in mind, and be responsible about that. I know that. But whenever I look at him, and I feel the anger at what he did building up, I hear his voice. I hear him admonishing me for losing control, telling me that it will not help getting angry. That used to be calming once, but now it just riles me up all the more. She exhaled the remaining air and looked down, before quietly finishing her explanation. The part of me that still wants to care, wants to see him, wants to ask him if it really was all just a show. It wants to think he truly did care, and that he just couldn't see what he was really doing to me. But the other part knows it doesn't matter. He did so many awful things, and it just doesn't matter whether he thought he was doing a good deed with it or not. I can feel it. I hate him, and yet I still desperately want to ask him if, despite everything, does he still love me? But the other part knows that whether he does or not is irrelevant, and hearing it will only make things worse. She looked at James, who had slowly also sat up in the meantime, with a reddening face and eyes twinkling in the light of the room. "I don't understand it," she said, her dishevelled mane of hair seeming even more wild than usual, while her hanging ears sunk down into it. She reached her free hand up to cover part of her face, the contradicting feelings inside her likely threatening to completely break out in their conflict with each other. James didn't know if he could truly understand it either. Of course, superficially, there was nothing too complex involved. Loving a person who raised and loved you for many years wasn't strange. Neither was hating someone who had done so many heinous things and also tried to use you as a tool for them. But was it ultimately really that simple? Or were emotions simply something that couldn't just be summarized entirely by reason quite so easily? However, in a way, while he maybe didn't understand them, he at least knew the feelings that she was describing. Like a word in another language, the meaning of which he didn't know, but that he had still heard often enough to recognize it by its sound. Because many years ago, when he was still young, he too had often lied away and wondered why a part of him had so desperately wanted to hear those simple free words out of a person that he had loathed for quite a long time. He had gotten over it with time, but he didn't know if he had any advice on how one would be able to do that in a faster or less painful manner. However, he did know something that, while he wasn't sure if it would have helped him back in the day, he did certainly yearn for back then. Pushing himself across the bed, he wrapped his arms around her in an embrace, gently pressing her to his chest. Miat were of course different from humans, especially when it came to matters of contact and comfort. However, it felt like it hardly mattered in this case. She just seemed surprised at first, and simply allowed him to press her against him without actually making any motions of her own to contribute to it. Still, gradually, she loosened her stiffened posture and shifted her weight around a bit, so she could more easily lean against him, while allowing the embrace to continue. Somewhere, far in the back of his mind, a dark thing glimpsed out of James for a split second. It remembered how he had eventually stopped caring, and how much easier it would be for Sheeta if she just skipped to that point. "He's gone," it wanted him to say. "He did such terrible things to you. Now he's getting his comeuppance. You don't need to care about him anymore." In a way, that may have been true, but it was also far from reality. Of course, Could she just flip a switch and not care anymore? She would most likely do that. But she would also not need anyone to tell her to do it. And James knew for a fact, had someone said that to him back in the day, it would not have helped. It's completely normal to feel that way, was what he instead said, pushing that thing back into the depths where it belonged. I don't know if I can tell you anything that would make it less confusing, but you don't have to deal with it by yourself, alright? Although she didn't say anything, he felt her nodding against his chest, causing him to hold her even tighter for a second. Then, after a while, he felt her push slightly against him, so he quickly released her so the situation wouldn't feel confining for her. She looked at him without saying anything, the expression on her face thankful but still tired and confused. James didn't know if she wanted to say something, but didn't, or if the silence was exactly her intention. But even if it was, there was one thing he needed to get out, even if a part of him felt that this may not exactly be the best moment for it. He didn't really care. "I love you," he said, both assuring her and stating it for the world, even as they were alone. And despite her worried expression, she'd have cracked into a smile at his words, that tried his best to fight through her conflicting emotions. As it broke out through worry and confusion, they were still very much present and likely wouldn't just go away anytime soon. "I love you too," she said back, her voice not showing any signs of hesitation, despite the mix of emotions carried along with it. Then, she leaned in for another hug, this time also wrapping her arms around him before slowly rubbing the side of her head along his. They remained like that for a while. James had no idea how long, but eventually they stopped. "Is food still an option?" she'd asked as they pulled apart, and James smiled earnestly at her. "Of course, treasure." A while later, after they had plenty of time to stuff their bellies with the food delivered by the room service, with their usual spiel about Sheeda doing her best to get her hands on James's, to her, inedible food, while the human tried his best to prevent his girlfriend from giving herself indigestion or worse, playing out as it did most of the time, they had returned to some quiet time, although now it wasn't just spent with staring at the ceiling, and instead had devolved into them independently doing things to pass the time on their phones, or simply lying right next to each other, every now and then leaning over to show the other something particularly interesting they had found on their screens. At first, they had wanted to simply turn the TV on to provide some white noise or distracted entertainment for a bit. However, it has soon turned out that the very day they were now trying to escape from was now occupying what seemed to be every single channel out there in an apparently endless loop of news broadcasts on the topic, leading them to quickly turn the thing off again and switch to more on-demand style media. James briefly scoffed as he randomly came across a familiar picture during his search, with an ancient pig-shaped stone pot staring back at him out of beady indentations forming the facsimile of eyes. "Good old hogpot," he whispered to himself, as the memory of Admir trying to cheer him up with this very picture during the elections came to his mind. Sheeda's ears twitched at his words, and she briefly tilted her head to look at his screen, although it didn't seem like she got the joke. However, then, the alarm tone of someone being at their door suddenly rang out across the room, causing the both of them to lift their heads to stare at the stairs, leading up to the trapdoor entrance for a moment. Clicking his current screen away for a second, James lifted his phone to his face while activating the always-opened communication line between him and his colleagues, unmuting his microphone in the application to quickly ask, "Any of you at our door?" Of course, he was well aware that most likely the people in constant contact with him would have called in for a second, announcing themselves before they would come over. And much like he had expected, the answers he got were generally to the negative. Although, without him even asking for it, One of them went a step beyond, as Admir soon announced to him, "Looks like 2 foxes at your door. I don't see any obvious weapons, but they're just covered enough to hide something. Want us to check them out?" James furrowed his brow for just a moment. However, he soon enough remembered the invitation he himself had made to 2 Lakshasets not too long ago, which caused him to quickly decline the offer. "No, we'll handle it," James quickly said through the line, not expecting this to be of too much concern, at least hopefully. And even if it was, he and Shida would likely be able to deal with it by themselves. They were just 2 Lakshaset, after all, maybe concerning for most average people, but not exactly all too dangerous for high-class Deathworlders. Standing up, James quickly reached for his discarded clothes on the ground to pull them over, before approaching the door. Shida quickly tailed him as they moved up to the entrance, which had 2 options of granting somebody access. One was to simply walk up there and open it yourself. The other was to unlock it via the terminal in the wall, to allow the people atop to enter by themselves. Seeing as they still needed to show at least some caution, despite being fairly sure that no evil intentions were being had by their visitors, they simply ordered the computer to open the door, while confronting their identity with a hand on a bioscanner. With a maybe overcautious hand on his weapon, James then called the visitors inside. The hatch was soon slowly opened, which seemed to be complicated somewhat by the Lakshaset's comparatively small and scrawny frames, and 2 familiar faces carefully poked their heads inside, looking down the stairs into the room. James quickly scanned them up and down. Like Admir has said, they were technically covered enough to be hiding something on their person, given that they had clad themselves in what looked to be some form of work aprons that looked to be more meant for safety purposes than just general clothing. However, their hands were clearly visible outside of any pockets, and their body language also didn't indicate any ill intent, as their heads slowly turned so they could take in the room. Therefore, he, at least for the moment, took his hand off his weapon. "Would you like to come inside?" he asked loudly, making the Vulpine faces snap around to him. The polished metal around Ajaxia's artificial eye sheened in the light as she moved, being the first to step inside, while Livexar seemed to momentarily hesitate a bit, likely after having seen the fact that James was armed, and, at least in a way, clearly ready to use that weapon if he deemed it necessary. However, seeing his usually meeker, conspecific hurry forth without any seeming worry, he soon followed after her, though one of his hands seemingly subconsciously raised up to the deep scars covering his neck defensively. "I'm assuming you've seen our fiasco on the picture show?" James asked nonchalantly anyway, ignoring the man's apprehension, while crossing his arms to appear less threatening out the gate. "I'm surprised you're still willing to associate with us after that." Livexar made a dismissive noise. However, Ajaxia wasted little time in approaching James directly, looking up at him with big yellow and green eyes. "I wouldn't call it a fiasco. You handled yourself better than most would," she complimented, and at least to James it sounded genuine. Her barely moving, fluffy tail at least seemed to indicate that she wasn't particularly nervous about the interaction in any way. "And much worse than many others would have," James replied with a sigh, knowing full well that his performance could likely have been much better had he actually been trained or just learned to handle situations like this. But no matter how well I did in talking about it, it doesn't change much about the fact that the topic itself would be enough to keep most people away. Seeming for some reason to be rather emboldened when compared to their first meeting, the Lakshaset stopped in place to crank her neck up and look at him even more directly than before while stating, "Look me in the eyes and tell me that I'm like most people." James admittedly had a hard time to not at least smirk at that, both because of the context and because his brain had a hard time reconciling such a serious voice coming out of a face like that, even if that was probably not exactly nice on his part. Shida, on the other hand, seemed to be more on the sober side when it came to these visitors, as she informed the smaller woman, "Not as impactful as you might think, given that he grew up on Earth. Eye replacements aren't exactly an exceptional sight there." James nodded his head sideways in a true enough kind of gesture. Although, admittedly, eyes were those kinds of body parts that were more rarely replaced artificially, with people generally opting more for the cloning route when it came to their peepers. "He still knows that it's not like that in the rest of the galaxy," Ajaxia defended herself, with her head snapping around to the feline in a gesture that honestly looked like she broke it with the movement alone. "And you definitely know as much," Levexar added onto that, clearly implying something with his words while his hand remained on his scars. Not liking the turn this took, James clapped his hands to break it up and exhaled slowly. "Well," he said loudly, and looked back and forth between the two lecture set. "I guess with the cat being out of the bag now, this invitation to a more private discussion has lost a lot of its luster. No need to whisper about anything anymore. It's true, we know or realized. I guess it's much less fun to hear me say it now that you already know about it." The last question that Ajaxia had asked him was of course still on his mind. "Is it true as well?" He strongly assumed that was what she had meant by that. And indeed, although she was obviously already aware of that fact by now, just hearing James state it so casually once more seemed to ignite a little light inside of the lecture set. "That is unprecedented," Ajaxia mumbled quietly through her sharp teeth, seemingly uninterested in playing along with James's little preamble, and instead getting straight to the point. "And you are sure that she is not hostile towards organics?" Admittedly, James was a bit surprised at the directness of all this. But still, it was all on the table now, so he had no reason to hold back or be suspicious in any way. "As sure as I can be," he said with a shrug. "She's lived peacefully on Dunama for a while, and has made it her task to raise and care for abandoned children. There are few less hostile lifestyles that I can imagine." The Vulpine's stiff eyes opened a little bit wider at his words, and their ears seemed to expand as widely as they could, as if to not miss a single sound wave of his explanations. "Remarkable," Levexar said, with a hand quickly rubbing away at some of the short fur on his face. His head then snapped around so he could look at Shida. "How did you do it? Your people? How did she become like this?" Shida was quite obviously out of her depth with that question, and she wasn't the only one. After all, Aveslon had not even been able to answer that much herself. "We don't know either," was all the feline could say, with a reserved but excusing gesture of her arm, waving the topic off. "There has to be some variable to our programs or something, I guess, but to this day we haven't figured that out. If he had, this whole story would be a whole lot easier to sell. She's not hostile because we did X or Y. It's a lot easier to digest than she isn't hostile because she just isn't." It seemed that she had added that last part on there to indicate that she really had no reason to lie about that topic, as it was honestly rather detrimental that they didn't know what exactly caused the seeming pacifism of Dunama's AIs. Of course, what stood out to James during the conversation was more the lecture set's excitement at the usually rather taboo topic. "You don't seem to be all too afraid of realized," he said, noting that these two reacted with much less apprehension than even he himself felt at the entire situation. Levexar's head snapped back to James at almost sickening speed, and his tail gave a single restrained wag. "Just imagine the possibilities," he said, through clearly held back enthusiasm. "Amicable AIs could revolutionize entire sectors of technology, should they be willing to work with us. The processing power that a fully digitalized realize can amass across multiple systems is entirely unparalleled by anything we could organize ourselves. Calculations and simulations so far deemed impossible could suddenly become achievable within our lifetime, if this breakthrough you are talking about is truly happening. We could quite possibly be traveling to other galaxies in a not indeterminable time frame. Although it was, in a way, nice to have someone so seemingly eager to be on their side for once, James did feel the need to pump the brakes a bit, as he calmly raised his hands. "Breakthrough?" he asked, not entirely sure what to make of that specific phrasing that the Lacheset was using here. Right now, we're still trying to prevent her existence itself from causing a war, and keep in mind that is still a person we are talking about here. A scientifically interesting one, to be sure, but that shouldn't distract us from that fact. Seemingly picking up on James's worries, at least superficially, Levexa managed to bring his demeanour from a 10 down to about a 5, as he gradually calmed himself down. "Of course," he quickly said, raising his hands in a way that made it unclear if he was also trying to calm the situation, or if he was simply mirroring James's gesturing. "I wasn't implying otherwise, but out of all the possible people that could realize, how high are the chances of not at least one of them being interested in science as well?" That was, at least if said in earnest, a far more reasonable take on the situation. "And you really aren't afraid of possible other implications of Realize being at large at all?" Sheeta then chimed in, sounding honestly curious. Of course, her own culturally impacted demeanour towards Realized was marked by a much similar nonchalant attitude towards the topic. However, the Miat also had very good reasons to not fear these beings. Seeing as the Lacheset seemed just as surprised by the amicable AI as most others were, it didn't seem to James like they had a similar background in their culture. "Only to a degree that is reasonable," Levexa replied, with an eager nod of his head that James couldn't quite interpret to have a particular meaning. "Of course, we know of the technical dangers through information that has been provided to us over the years. However, so many species living in the community, including humans by the way, are incredibly proficient at combating AI through their histories, and therefore it is unlikely that being more peaceful towards their existence will have any tremendously negative outcomes." Seemingly picking up on some skepticism, Ajaxia also spoke up once more calmly than her company. "The Lacheset's technological evolution has always involved a high level of compartmentalization of data, which, inadvertently, very effectively circumvented the very conditions that are needed for the process of realization to take place, meaning that throughout our entire history, we perceive realized intelligence to be something far outside our technological scope, until we met the galactic community," she explained in pleasant, professional terms. At which point you were told to better stop trying to create it right then and there, I presume. James connected the dots in his head. Ajaxia nodded. "Our entire knowledge of Realize is based on second-hand accounts and narratives," she added to her explanation. "That was enough to make a large number of our people wary of the subject, and our government went along with the community's general ban on trying to deliberately create Realized. However, for some of us who were, for one reason or another, less likely to buy into the community's general narratives, the topic has always remained enticing." As she explained herself, her hand wandered up to the rust-red metal surrounding her artificial eye. Inadvertently, James briefly moved his own mechanical arm, as if the limb itself needed to express his understanding of her words. "Well, as long as you're being honest about that, I'm not really in a position to turn away such direct support," James chuckled, before a different thought came to him, and he turned to the other Volpine with a questioning expression. "But what about your big friend? What's he thinking on the topic?" Getting a glimpse into the opinions and perspectives that had emerged during the Deathworlder's meeting was probably a good idea. The Liga Mordular have their very own thoughts on, well, most things, the Vexar said with such an honest laugh that it took James off guard. You really shouldn't worry about them. However, in the meantime, his arm's brief twitch has seemingly done its job of pulling attention onto the appendage, as Ajaxager took a long, intense look at it. You said your arm had been made by a friend of yours, correct? Based on the way you talked, I'm assuming the cyborg that is accompanying you? She asked, forcing James to decide which of the two conversations he should put his focus on. However, as it seemed like Levexar was mostly laughing his concerns off, the decision wasn't all too hard. You'd be correct, James said with a nod. Although that is a bit of an odd circumstance. You don't need to have a cybernetic engineer friend to get a prosthetic on Earth. The Lacheset seemed a bit sullen, despite James's casually pleasant words. Your speech, she started her next point, however seemed to gradually rethink the way she wanted to approach the topic, as she remained quiet for a bit, before ultimately starting over in a different vein. Someone tried to kill them once, right? James looked up slightly at that. Although that was certainly a topic that was reasonable to be curious about, bringing it up out of the blue like this was rather strange. That is also correct, he still confirmed for her, figuring it would be best to give her the benefit of the doubt for a moment, and possibly pulling the plug on the conversation if it got too strange. The Lacheset's tail began to very slowly wag, and her massive ears twitched slightly, as she obviously tried her best to not appear too apprehensive about the very serious topic she had brought up, while still staying respectful. My doctor was also, she began, but cut herself off, shaking her head. But he's not with us anymore. I know arms and eyes aren't really comparable, but considering their appearance, I'm assuming, well, do you think that maybe your friend could take a look at... Her demeanor got more and more closed off as she spoke, as she seemingly sank into herself and started fiddling with her fur, while her tail's wagging became faster. Something about this request seemed to really be bothering her. But, even if that was strange, James knew Curie well enough to make an educated guess on one thing. Gently, he raised his mechanical hand to put it onto the Vulpine's shoulder, as he looked at her reassuringly. I have a feeling they might just be happy to.